Okay, we're going to wrap up Module 3 with one last lesson. This lesson is called the Gross Domestic Product. And what we've been looking at this unit is the basic tools that we need to understand macroeconomics. And we already understand that we have two problems we're facing: inflation and unemployment, the two evil heads of the macro monster. So what the heck is gross domestic product? Well, gross domestic product really is sort of our way of measuring whether or not we're doing a good job defeating inflation and unemployment. And that's not a perfect definition by any means. We're going to get to a definition in a second. But generally, gross domestic product is one of the measurements that economists use to understand how strong an economy is doing. And to get into that, I want to start by defining what it actually means. And this definition is very important and very precise. So we're going to look at each of the terms in this definition. Okay, so the definition is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given period of time, and usually that period of time is a year. Now, if you look at all of those words, each of those things, the value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a year, all of those things are critical to understanding to what exactly we mean when we say the GDP. The short version is, it's the total value of all the stuff we made in the country in 1 year. And we break it up into essentially 4 separate categories, and I'm going to list them here now. The first is we start with what's called consumption, and we'll get into what the details of each of these are in just a minute. We then have investment, government spending, and what's known as net exports. Now, I put all 4 of those on this screen for 2 purposes. One, to make you realize that when we count up and we add up the GDP, we try to break it into various categories to have it make some sense. The other thing is, you may from time to time hear me refer to what I call SIGNIX. Well, if you look at C, I, G, and X, that's my little acronym that helps me remember what the different components of GDP are. C, I, G, and X. What I want to do now is take a look at each of them individually. Okay, let's start with consumption. And you can see I've included a picture of a mall here because when you think of consuming, the mall is probably a place you might first think. Okay, what is consumption exactly? Consumption is very simple. It's spending by households on goods and services. And very specifically, that includes a lot of things. That includes things that you can touch and feel, goods. It includes things like services, like, so for example, if you went and had somebody give you a haircut, that's a service, and that is part of what we call consumption. As long as whatever you purchased, whether it's a thing or it's something someone did for you, as long as that thing had value, then we count that as part of the GDP. Now, what we should also note is what it does not include. What is not considered consumption for the purposes of GDP? The first is what we call non-final goods, or what we might call intermediate goods. And a good example of this might be, for example, if a manufacturer of rubber produced raw rubber. That probably wouldn't be counted in the GDP very often because very few people would actually buy raw rubber off the shelf at a store, let's say. What happens to that raw rubber? Well, it goes into things like tires, whatever else rubber goes into. So if we counted that rubber when it was just rubber, and then we counted the tire, we would in effect be counting the rubber twice. So generally speaking, we don't count things until they reach their final stage. One way to think about this would be if you took flour and you put flour in a bag and sold that bag of flour at the store, that would be counted in the GDP as consumption. But if you took flour and used it to make a loaf of bread, that original flour would not be counted in the GDP, but the bread would be. This way we're not double counting. The other thing that often people forget about that is not included is what are called used goods. And the used goods are very simply not counted because they were counted once already. They were counted in the year they were made. So if somebody buys a used car from someone else, that does not count in the GDP. Again, because that car was already counted in whatever year it was produced in originally. So we do not count used goods. And by the way, consumption is a pretty important part of the formula because it's about 70% of the GDP. Most of what we do in GDP is consumption. Okay, our second category is called investment. Now that's a funny term that very often we get confused in economics. The way we usually use the word investment in the real world, we might think of things like stocks and bonds. In macroeconomics, we don't usually use the word investment to mean exactly that. In fact, those things I just described, we usually call savings. It's just a fancy way of savings. Investment in our world means something a little different. It means one of three things. The first thing it could mean is purchase of what are called capital goods, and we've come across that term before already. Capital refers to any goods that are used to produce other goods. So I often use the example of a bulldozer, right? Nobody buys a bulldozer for a bulldozer. They buy a bulldozer because it can help them make other things. Nobody buys a factory machine for the factory machine. They buy it because it helps them make something else. That's a capital good, and that's considered investment. The second thing, which gets a little bit confusing, is what's called inventory. Now, inventory by definition is items that were produced but not sold within a given year. So if Dell Computers makes 1,000 computers and can't sell them in that year, the value of that computer, we don't want to call it consumption, but we also don't want to throw it away. We count it as inventory. It's sort of almost like they're investing and buying it themselves as a company. So inventory is anything that you produce as a company that you cannot sell that year. Now, one important point to make sure we understand is this. This is kind of a small point, but worth noting. Items sold from a previous year's inventory are counted as an addition to consumption and subtraction from inventory. And that's a little confusing, but really it's not that hard to understand. If in 2012 Dell made those computers and didn't sell them, it had to count them as inventory. Let's say those computers were worth, I don't know, $100,000. If in 2013 Dell was able to sell those computers, they would now count as consumption. But we already counted them as inventory in 2012. So how do we make sure that we're not getting the value twice? We now subtract inventory from that year. So in fact, those computers being sold are actually a total of a 0 for 2013 because they were counted in 2012. There'll be a plus to consumption and a negative to inventory. That's sort of a subtle point and not a real big concern. As long as we know what inventory is, for the most part, we're okay. But that's sort of an additional thought. The last thing that's included in investment is housing, specifically newly constructed homes or structures. This is probably the one thing that households do purchase that we do not count in consumption. And probably it's mostly because it's such a large investment that it doesn't seem to make sense to put it in the same category with consumption. So if you buy a house from someone else, that does count as being used and does not count in the GDP. We don't think of houses as being used very often, I guess, but they are, of course. If another owner had owned the home and then sold it to you, that is a used house. And we only count the value of that house in the year that it was built. One thing that confuses folks also sometimes is we talk about rent. When people rent an apartment, it often gets asked, does that count in the GDP? Well, as it turns out, it does, but it doesn't count as investment. If you rent a house or rent an apartment, the value of that rent is consumption. You've essentially consumed the time, the space of that apartment. That's called rent, and we do count that as consumption. But we do not count it as investment because we didn't build a new apartment or a new home. So yes, renting a place does count in the GDP, but not as investment, as consumption. Okay, the third category is pretty straightforward, government spending. And the definition couldn't be simpler, right? anything the government spends on goods and services, whether it be state, local, or federal government. So they could be purchasing a tank, they could be purchasing toilet paper for their bathrooms. Whatever they spend is counted in the GDP. And it's such a large chunk of our economy, we just simply wanted to separate it from regular old consumption. One very important note in a vocab term we should know. Government spending does not include what we call transfer payments. Now, transfer payments happen in a lot of instances, but particularly with government spending. Transfer payments are when you simply move money from one person to another. So, for example, if the federal government sends a refund check for your income taxes to you, that does not count in the GDP. That does not count as government spending. That's called a transfer payment. They just moved money from them to you. If you put money in your bank account, that does not count in the GDP. That's just moving money from you into your bank account. The key idea is that unless that money is being used to create something new, then it doesn't count. It is considered a transfer payment. Now, if that income tax refund came to you and you then spent it to buy, I don't know, a new lawnmower, that will then count as consumption in the GDP. But the actual act of moving money from anybody, but particularly the government who often does it, to a person, that alone does not count in the GDP. Okay, our final category is called net exports. This is a category we're going to spend quite a bit of time on in our very last module, but we're going to just mention it now as part of GDP. So first, what is the definition of net exports? Well, very simply, the term is exports minus imports. That's how we define net exports. Exports minus imports. And so, as an example, if country X consumes $200 worth of imports, but exports $300 worth of its own, its net exports is $100, or 300 minus 200. Now, just to make sure that we're clear, we do need to know exactly what it means to export and import goods. And I think most of you probably have a pretty good idea of that, but we do have a very specific definition and we want to make sure we understand. To understand that, we need to understand what the word domestically produced means, or the phrase domestically produced. A domestically produced good is a good produced on a nation's soil, even if it's owned by a foreigner. That is the definition that GDP uses to consider something produced domestically or produced within the nation. That was not always true. Years and years ago, it used to be very different. It used to be counted by if it was produced by a citizen of yours, regardless of where that person was, it was counted as part of your economy, as your production. But we've changed that over the years because the economy has become so global. It's much more important to consider what's being produced literally on your soil, and less is important to consider what your people are producing all over the world. You know, Coke might be considered an American company, but it produces, in fact, most of its Coke is produced overseas now, so to count that doesn't make a lot of sense. So producing domestically means that we're producing on our soil, regardless of who's producing it. Now, with that definition, we can explain exports and imports. A good is an export if it is produced domestically and sold to a foreign nation. I think that now makes sense. A good is an import if it is not produced domestically, so it's produced somewhere else, but is consumed domestically. Okay, now that we know all the categories of GDP, we should take a quick look at what is not included in the GDP. We already know some of them. Used goods are not included. We know intermediate or non-final goods, goods that haven't taken their final shape yet. Those are not included. We talked about transfer payments, just moving money alone, that doesn't count. Savings, putting money in a savings account, a stock or a bond, again, you're not creating anything new by doing that, so that doesn't count. Home-produced goods, they don't count, which is an unfortunate thing about GDP. If you produce it at home, it doesn't do any good. And lastly, black market sales. Black market sales, obviously because no one's watching them, are not included in the GDP.